both for coming out tonight. I'm really happy to be back here in Newport, and especially the Newport Historical Society, to talk to you tonight about a remarkable episode that's central to the history of Rhode Island, to the history of New England, even to the history of the United States in its early years. And I want to thank the Newport Historical Society for hosting this event. This repository was crucial and valuable to the research in this book, and you'll see why in just a moment. It has an amazing collection of local Newport history that proved crucial to my telling of this story. And it's always been a pleasure to research here in the times that I have done so, and now to return to tell the story after I've done that research as well. But let me first offer a big thank you to Elizabeth, who I think she just stepped out anyway, so thank you, Elizabeth, for everything she did to make this event possible today. So the story I tell in this book begins in a little corner of this little state 191 years ago. And I'd like to begin by reading an opening scene, the beginning of the first act of this story. So this is in the book, Act 1, Murder, Scene 1, the haystack. Stepping out of his farmhouse, John Durfee noticed a chill had set in. The earth crackled under each step of his boots. It was the first day of winter, December 21st, 1832, a Friday. The previous day had been a seasonably pleasant autumn afternoon with clear skies and a new moon setting early in the evening. Overnight, the temperature had dropped to near 20 degrees and a steady wind blew from the west. Durfee's farm lay along the main road in the sleepy village of Tiverton, Rhode Island, where Durfee and his neighbors made the most of farming small plots of coastal land. They toiled for generations, supplementing their modest income by fishing and by exchanging paid labor with one another. Tiverton sat a quarter mile south of the Massachusetts state line. Across that line stood the bustling textile manufacturing town of Fall River. Durfee walked to the barn, hitched up his team of horses, and set off downhill toward the Taunton River. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. He got no farther than a few hundred yards when he saw a woman's body hanging from a fence post inside his haystack yard. Approaching the figure, uncertain if she were dead or alive, he parted the hair that had fallen in front of her face. One look must have sent a shiver through the farmer's already cold body. A rope stretched 6 inches above the woman's neck, securing her rigid form to the stake. No longer was it a typical winter morning. Glimpsing 2 men within view, he shouted out to them. Within moments, Durfee's 2 neighbors arrived, along with his elderly father, Richard, who heard his son's cry from the farmhouse door. The 4 men gazed at the woman for a moment, examining just how she was hanging. Then John Durfee climbed over the fence and into the stackyard and tried to hoist her body so that he could slip the rope off the top of the pole. Unable to lift the body with one arm and slip the rope off with the other, he heard his father's impatient holler, "Cut her down." Handed a knife, Durfee cut the rope near the top of the stake and laid the body on the ground. Then he ran to get the coroner. News spread quickly. Within minutes, a young constable from Fall River named Seth Darling arrived, along with a crowd of onlookers. Darling surveyed the grass surrounding the stackyard and observed, and others agreed, that there appeared to be no evidence of a struggle. No one in the small crowd knew the young woman. She surely must be, Darling thought, one of Fall River's factory girls, as workers in the mills were commonly called. A young woman's violent death, no matter the cause, signaled trouble for a factory town. So this is the way this story begins. In the hours that followed, a local Methodist leader identified the deceased woman as Sarah Maria Cornell, not knowing that for most of her adult life she had gone by the name of Maria, so I'll refer to her as Maria Cornell this evening. Then a doctor from Fall River also arrived, and he told the men who had gathered assembled as a coroner's jury that the young woman had visited his office suspecting that she might be pregnant. And she confided to him that she believed the father to be a Methodist preacher named Avery from nearby Bristol, Rhode Island, a married man with children. Uncertain whether the death had been by suicide, the men on the inquest jury, like all avid consumers of popular fiction in that era, felt they knew how to complete the story that began with an unmarried pregnant woman seduced by a married man and now found hanging from the end of a rope. So they initially ruled her death a suicide, and the coroner gave permission to bury Cornell's body. So let me pick up the scene where that continues. It was still Saturday morning when Fall River's congregational minister recited a funeral prayer over Maria Cornell as she was buried in the Durfee family cemetery on their farm. As John Durfee helped lower the coffin into its grave, he remained unsettled by the previous day's events. After the burial, his wife Nancy prepared Cornell's personal effects to be sent to her family. Combing through the bandbox stored under the bed, Nancy came upon the crumpled sheet of paper that John had seen the day before and saw that it was a note. It seemed to have been written hastily, dated the day of the woman's death. It read, "If I am missing, inquire of the Reverend Mr. Avery Bristol. He will know where I am gone." Signed, S.M. Cornell. This is a contemporary drawing of the Durfee farm, and this is a contemporary reproduction of the note. I'll talk more about that a little bit as well. Suddenly, vague details in the unsigned letters, those unsigned letters were found in her trunk along with this bandbox that had this note. Suddenly, the vague details in the unsigned letters seemed less a mystery and the assumptions about suicide less convincing. Combined with Dr. Wilbur's story and the suspicions of the women who had laid out the body, the note suggested more plainly that an act of violence had been committed by the Reverend Ephraim K. Avery of Bristol. Those spare words, "if I should be missing," suggested a tale that might easily have been buried along with Cornell's body. Over the next year and beyond, though, that note would incite endless stories from countless storytellers, rippling outward from Fall River and New England to enter the national consciousness. From the moment a farmer discovered Maria Cornell's lifeless body, people turned to an assortment of labels to describe her. She was a Methodist, a crazy woman, a pious female, a prostitute, a wayward daughter. But most of all, she was a factory girl, which carried its own array of preconceptions. So as I say, that's the beginning of this story. What I'd like to do this evening is to share with you some of my thoughts about why this particular violent death becomes an irresistible topic of popular fascination in its own time. And what makes this a fascinating story for a researcher and writer and teacher like me in our own times. After all, it was a nationwide scandal, but it was also a local upheaval for residents of Fall River, residents of Tiverton, in fact, for towns all over New England, including here in Newport, which was the site of Avery's trial for murder that follows this case. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. This case was arguably the most important episode in the history of the state of Rhode Island before the Civil War, perhaps with the exception of the Dorr Rebellion. But it was also a pivotal history in the early history of the United States. Any violent death, particularly a murder, can rend the fabric of individuals' lives and disrupt a community, be that a family, a neighborhood, a town. But not every murder becomes something larger than the crime itself. Yet every once in a while, a crime takes on greater meaning and significance. And eventually Americans would come to know this as one of the defining features of their popular culture. Sensational criminal trials that get labeled the crime of the century, even if they seem to happen every decade or so. Here's just some of those examples. From Lizzie Borden's to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, to the Leopold and Loeb murders, and eventually at the end of the 20th century to the O.J. Simpson trial as well. And you can see that there as well. The trial of the Reverend Ephraim K. Avery for the murder of Maria Cornell was the nation's first spectacular trial. And it took place here in Newport. And Americans at that time couldn't get enough of it. Hang on for just a moment. Before this trial could play itself out, it had become the longest criminal trial yet in the history of the United States. When most trials, even for capital crimes like murder, typically lasted for 1 or 2 days at the most, this one lasted a full month, with over 250 witnesses sworn to testify. It took longer to pick a jury. It took longer for the attorneys to make their closing arguments than it typically took for a whole trial. And this case seemed to be about so many different matters. One of the reporters who attended Avery's trial and who published his transcript of the proceedings called this, in his words, quote, "the most extraordinary of all extraordinary cases." I love that phrase. For all that it touched on. For in his words, there was law for the lawyers, anatomy for the doctor, theology for the minister, knots and navigations for the sailor. There seemed to be something for every occupation. A person, he wrote, could learn more about human nature by coming to Newport and attending just one day of this trial than they could learn from reading books for a whole year. And for me as an historian, there was also more history in this episode than any historian might dream. As spectators at the trial and audiences who read the many accounts and transcripts, almost like they were virtually there at the trial, saw in what happened and occurred the changing society in which they lived unfolding before their very eyes. They saw in the saga's main characters, in a mill girl and an evangelical preacher, but also in the stories told by hundreds of witnesses, they saw a glimpse of the life experiences of their own neighbors, their friends, their families. They saw, in other words, keenly that the issues that mattered in their own personal lives were being played out in front of them in a legal thriller. It was about all kinds of aspects of this changing society. It was about the beginning of women in the wage-earning workforce, women who went off to work in the mills, factory mills in places like Fall River. It was about gender and masculinity, about sex and medicine and bodies, about abortion and sexually transmitted disease. It was about how evangelical religion was beginning to assert its importance in American culture and politics. It was about celebrity clergymen and their all too frequent sex scandals. It was about even the invention of true crime and detective tales. And it was about conspiracy politics and fake news. And most of all, it was about how do people carry out criminal justice in a popular democracy. I'm going to talk to you a little about some of those as well. When you read this book, you'll discover that I tried to make this history unfold like a play. Since I tell readers from the very beginning that this was a social drama, that they were witnessing something that seemed like a dramatic effect for them. And as such, I've divided the book into 3 acts. And as I mentioned to you, Act one is called murder. After all, it was not enough at that time merely to witness the trial live, and people did that. They flocked by the thousands to attend, or to experience it vicariously on the written page, and it did become bestsellers to read the trial reports. Americans longed for this drama also to unfold in popular culture as well. 2 long-running plays were written and performed. The first one here in Newport. And here's an advertisement for that play. And another blockbuster hit in New York City. And here I have the Newport advertisement on the left called The Factory Girl, and the one on the right called Sarah Maria Cornell, or The Fall River Murder, was performed in a Broadway theater in New York. But in addition to that, popular songs were written and sold and performed repeatedly in Broadway reviews for months on end. Here's just some examples of the kinds of song sheets that people might purchase and read. This one called Lines on the Commemoration of Sarah M. Cornell, and I forget, On the Death of Sarah Maria Cornell was the other one. And in this instance, the song The Factory Maid was composed by a blind poet named John Graham, and had a weeks-long run in New York theaters in which audiences would call it out for repeatedly. This is common in theaters in the antebellum period, in which the performance would go on and the audience would simply just yell out for what it wanted to have for an encore, and the players would proceed to sing. And in this case, the audience knew this well enough that they would sing along and repeat the chorus that went, "Oh, weep for Maria, the poor factory maid, so charming, so fair, and so basely betrayed." Which is what you see in this as well. These popular theatrical plays and songs bracket the beginning and ending of the book. And you'll meet the characters in the plays, the actors who are performing them. You'll even see the graphic art that was made to be produced as posters that were plastered all over town, or were displayed outside the theaters, so audience would be attracted to come in and see it. This one, a pun on Avery's name, is called A Very Bad Man. And this one, which has a longer depiction called A Minister Extraordinary, implying somebody who is a foreign minister or a traveling ambassador, in this case a minister on an evil deed that he's going. And of course, he's leaving the scene where he has committed the crime, and assisted by the demons and such who assist him in this. This case itself just seemed dramatic to people in so many ways. And as the trial unfolded, it felt like a drama itself. Witnesses took the stand and they told tales. They told in many different personal settings before the trial, and they now started to tell it in a jam-packed courtroom in Newport, to even more dramatic effect. Most of all, this book, therefore, is a glimpse into the world of storytelling in the past. We can understand what this crime was and what it meant to people and why it became a nationwide scandal by unveiling the stories that Americans told about it, both inside and outside the courtroom. Although the crime takes place in Tiverton, and the community most interested in prosecuting the chief suspect was Fall River, a recently booming industrial town that had an interest in protecting the lives of its laborers, and to insisting that this was a safe place for women. But the murder trial took place in Colony House, Old Colony House in Newport, just down the hill from here. So I'd like to read to you the opening of the second act, Act 2, of this book, which is Trial. And this is a scene that's called Courtroom Tales. So Act 2, Scene 13, Courtroom Tales. Bright sunlight startled the prisoner's unprepared eyes. Newport's jailer led Ephraim Avery down the front steps of the jailhouse on a crisp spring morning, directing him to turn right. The preacher had to squint as the sun's rays struck harshly against the white-clapboard walls of the Methodist meeting house across the street. Some critics may have thought it fitting that Newport's Methodists had chosen to build their meeting house on the same street as the town jail, which you'll see here. But the first Methodist meeting house in America, in fact, it claims to be the first one in the world, to have both a steeple and a bell tower and a church bell, in fact, signaled how far this upstart sect had grown. Earlier Methodists considered such ostentatious displays of worldliness unfitting for their plain and serious piety, a prudent policy when parishioners were mostly poor laborers. In fact, a Methodist meeting house would be simpler in adornment than this space that we are in here at the Seventh-day Baptist meeting house that implies that. But the shiny white spire expressed the yearnings for respectability of a church that 3 decades earlier could only afford a lot across from the jailhouse. And if any of you know, the jail still exists. It is a bed and breakfast and inn right across the street from it. And as the jailer marched the preacher up a slight hill past the White Horse Tavern and alongside a militia commons that had hosted no battle training since the War of 1812, he steered him to the right once again onto Farewell Street. Avery probably didn't see the sign that's there in the dry cleaners that says, "Grime doesn't pay." I didn't put that in the book. Editors thought it might be a little bit too, but we just walked by it again to see that the sign's still there if you want. Avery's thoughts surely never strayed, however, too far from the chilling sense that his own life hung in the balance. Straight ahead stood Old Colony House, a 3-story Georgian-style brick building. And here's a contemporary illustration from that era in 1832. Its cupola catching the morning light. Shops all down Broadway were empty as everyone's attention that day, townfolk and visitors alike, was directed towards the courthouse, awaiting a glimpse of the notorious Methodist preacher. Colony House, erected nearly a century before, had been home to the Colonial Assembly before independence and continued as the state capitol during the early Republic. Avery climbed its stone steps under the balcony where the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in 1776, and he entered through the 12-foot-high doorway. The hand on the clock of the courthouse facade pointed to a few minutes past 10 o'clock. It was Tuesday morning, May 7th, 1833, the second day of Avery's trial before Rhode Island's Supreme Court. A day earlier, the court had begun the trial by directing the county sheriff to summon men for jury duty. When the preacher walked the several hundred paces to the courthouse that previous day, it was the first time he'd been outside in 2 months. After less than an hour, he was ushered back to his dark cell. For 3.5 months, he had been confined to a prison cell 14 feet square with only a 6 by 10 inch window, about so big, which surely provided insufficient lighting for reading or even discerning human faces. My ears assailed by the grating sound of bars of iron and the turning of keys, he recalled. It was enough almost to freeze my blood! Exclamation point, and end of quote. An unnerving silence blanketed the courtroom. All eyes fastened on the defendant as he bowed to the 3 justices and again to the prosecutor before taking his seat at the defense table. That's how the second act begins. The region's most illustrious legal talents gathered to try this case. At the prosecution table sat Rhode Island Attorney General Albert Greene, sitting alongside him was the previous state attorney general, who was now serving in Congress. And sitting alongside him was another prosecutor who would later become justice of the state Supreme Court. Contemporary newspaper accounts considered this to be tried by the best legal minds that were available. At Avery's side sat a Newport defense lawyer named Richard Randolph, hailing from one of Virginia's first families. In fact, a distant relative or cousin of Thomas Jefferson. But the star at the defense table was the venerable Jeremiah Mason, who you see on the right, the most renowned lawyer in all of New England. He was also a giant of a man, 6'7" tall, in an era in which probably very few men were taller than 5'9", in that sort of era. And Mason's talents didn't come cheap. The Methodist Church had hired the region's best and most expensive lawyer to defend Ephraim Avery, whose meager circuit rider salary could never pay for such counsel. It's estimated the Methodist Church paid something in the range of about $6,000 in all of its legal fees for this. Avery's annual salary was about $100, $150. Couldn't have paid that in his lifetime. Anticipating a swarm of onlookers for the most talked about case in anyone's memory, the court moved the trial to the Colony House's Great Hall on the first floor. Worried that their regular chamber, a floor above, capable of seating perhaps 100 people, would give way under the crowd's weight. The Great Hall held some 1,500 people, and on the trial's opening day, it was already teeming with spectators. Imagine this space. Well, as one reporter described it, the crowds were, quote, wedged in a mass on the floor. I imagine you couldn't even move in that sort of space. That's how much the tension was, and everybody wanted to be there and to see that trial. And crowds of out-of-town visitors descended on Newport for Reverend Avery's trials. Taverns, hotels, stables, all overflowed with two types of witnesses. The hundreds who came to testify in the trial and the thousands who came to witness something spectacular at that time. Here's Courthouse Square from this exact sort of period. I think this is painting was made in 1818. Washington Square is what you would call it, right outside of the old Colony House. This illustration is from roughly the same period, 1830s, when that takes place. I'm always struck by how unpopulated these are. There's almost nobody there, right? The one time that wasn't the case was in Avery's trial, where you probably couldn't make your way around that or through that. It was so immensely teeming with spectators they chartered special boats just to be able to travel people from Providence to get there and as well. And on the morning before the trial began, passersby in Courthouse Square found themselves serenaded by a lone man belting out a ballad of his own composition that was recorded as being as such. I can't sing it for you, but you can hear it nonetheless. Ye people, all a warning take, remember Avery's plot, enough to make your hearts to ache, don't let it be forgot. He killed the mother, then the child, what a wicked man was he. The devil helped him all the while. How wicked must he be? I don't know how many times he sang that over, but the public's excitement itself had become a character in this case, in the social drama that was happening. And it becomes so as people begin to suggest, can they make a valid judgment about it when emotions are running high and such. This is a contemporary illustration of Avery. I have no contemporary illustrations, so there are some that are mistakenly thought to be of Maria Cornell, but they are a template that's used for women in common stories, so it really isn't a picture of this. This is supposedly was by people who produced it, thought to be an accurate likeness. Avery's Methodist colleagues thought it was a terrible, offensive image that made him look, in their words, like a libidinous monster, was the term used for it. We could talk more about that if you wish to. But back in this day, there were no court stenographers recording the trial. Nobody sitting there doing it. No video recordings, so you'd have all of that. Instead, on the first day of the trial, 6 to 8 journalists and lawyers asked permission to sit at the bar and take their own notes and to create their own transcripts so that they could publish it in newspapers or eventually in book form so that people might be able to read it. And the court agreed to this, but imposed a gag order on them so that they would not be able to publish that until the trial was over, so therefore not privileging the thoughts of the juries or the community as such. The newspapermen couldn't wait long enough, so remember the trial lasts a full month. When the last week, some of these newspapermen start to publish the transcripts as well. As I mentioned earlier, this month-long trial, the nation's longest trial, touched on so many different facets of life in the era. And the trial itself hinged in part on disputes between male doctors, even professors from Harvard's medical school, and the experienced older Tiverton women who had prepared Cornell's body for burial. They disputed over who possessed the authority to assess the truth of facts about women's bodies, about abortion, about sexual violence, or about suicide. Who knew and could give the truthful answers to those questions? And the trial also revealed the workings of gossip and storytelling in a criminal case. Stories moved from locales and modes of talking in everyday life into the courthouse for everyone to hear, provoking questions then about the connections in many ways between religious experiences and sexual desire. For example, what had been told as religious confessions, as testimony, ends up getting repeated in the courtroom as salacious storytelling of what to do. And I talk about this and describe this in chapters in the book, scenes in this book that I entitled Bad Stories and Sex Talk, which are just two of the scenes of them. Murder in a Milltown, then, is a deeply human story about a young woman searching for her own independence. Maria Cornell lived and worked in a dozen different factory towns in the 10 years before her death at age 30. And her story belies the myth that mill girls, like those who worked in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is most famous of those things, they just went, they had left their farms, worked for a few years to save some money, married, and returned back to their rural communities and lived a domestic life. And it was just a brief parentheses in their life. Instead, other women like Maria had to work to survive, or they chose to work because it offered them a life of independence and autonomy. One factory girl this time wrote to her family, I'm just a girl of 19 years of age, and I have not yet lived a life I want to live. I'm going to choose to live the life I want. That's the sort of description of it. She went off to work in the mills, despite what would be her family's feelings about it. And Maria's family was not happy about her choosing to work in the factories. But Maria's story is a tale of a young woman who saw in the plentiful wages offered by mill work both an opportunity to fill her aspirations for independence, for her own control over her life, but also she experienced as well the vulnerable position that's put her in as a woman alone. This quest took her to nearly all of the major textile manufacturing towns of southern New England in these years. She worked in the mills of the Samuel Slater created factories around Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and its circle of mills. She worked in Lowell, Massachusetts explicitly, and those mills that were in that location. It was Lowell, America's premier industrial city, where she first encountered the Reverend Avery. And I'll leave it to readers to discover that relationship and what it was and what develops along those lines. But Maria was also searching for some kind of family that would accept and welcome her, especially as her family shunned her for her conversion to Methodism an upstart and enthusiastic religion, but also because of her work as a factory girl that was thought to be disreputable in that time period. So she thought and looked for a family that would welcome her, and when she did, it proved to be, in her case, a faith family, a faith community that thought of itself in family terms. And this is exactly what Methodists did. They tended to think of each other as close, intimate families. They called each other brothers and sisters. They had that sort of sense that they were close. She wanted the companionship and friendship, but she also wanted the spiritual nurturing that family might offer to her. As I write in the book, Maria embraced Methodists as her surrogate family, clinging to them with a ferocity that only a neglected daughter could know. This new family eased the painful memories of a broken home, an absent father, an inattentive mother, a sister's rivalry, and harsh words of family disapproval. But she was also searching for love and pleasure, even if she discovered, sadly, that the revolutions in sexual choices for young women at this time made them especially vulnerable to the power of men and to the surveillance and gossip of fellow women. And that's a major part of this story and how the story plays out. So this book speaks to a central important question for that age and for our own. Who is to be believed in cases of sexual crimes and sexual violence? It's important to remind ourselves, in other words, that there was a history that preceded a Me Too movement. And it's incredibly important for us to look at and see and tell the stories of the history of how American culture and legal system have exploited the victims of sexual crimes. And in this particular case, Avery's attorneys, the Methodist Church in particular, defense team, turned the trial into an investigation of the moral character of Maria Cornell, effectively putting her on trial, as one reporter called it, the trial of Maria Cornell instead of the trial of Ephraim Avery, arguing that her past illicit sexual conduct proved that she was more likely to commit suicide than to be murdered by a reputable clergyman. Maria Cornell, in other words, became one more example in a long history of courts redirecting the attention of a sex crime trial onto the sexual behavior and the morality of the female accuser, making the character of the woman, rather than the actions of the man, the key to a verdict. And so in this case, after a long trial, one in which there's testimony about medicine and bodies, ropes and knots and sex and sexual diseases and abortion and suicide that lasts for a month. Jurors were also requested that they might be able to take notes with paper, and they're told that's not the custom, so you have to remember everything that happens on your own. By the end of the month, the jury brought back a verdict of not guilty. But this was hardly the end of this story. Act 3 is called Scandal. This verdict sets off a nationwide scandal that lasted almost a year in time. Mobs and violence follow afterwards. Popular publications explode off the press for readers all along the eastern seaboard, from Maine to South Carolina, out as far west as Kentucky and Ohio. People are reading about it in newspapers. They're buying as consumer items the trial reports that they might engage in. More trial reports, more publications were produced about this case than any case that had preceded it, and any that probably concluded all the way up through the rest of the 19th century. And trial reports themselves, these lengthy descriptions that those reporters were taking their notes of, suddenly became a new popular reading genre in American life, whetting the appetite of readers for the birth of sensational crime news. Right on the eve of what would become the birth of tabloid news papers, what are called the penny press papers, that emerged in exactly that period. In fact, the first penny press paper in the United States, what's called the New York Sun in New York City, and its first cover on its first page has a story about Avery. Case. So Americans were already wedded and interested in the appetite for these stories. But as you'll read in the book, there were also fake stories that emerged, fakes and falsities, including a false confession from Avery, and fake news items surface as well. And then eventually there's also a lengthy and long-standing pamphlet war that emerges, in which people accuse each other of, and I'll talk about that in a moment, in which they take different sides over this case. In fact, this is the only case I know where the act of reading the trial transcripts or the trial reports is directly linked to 2 other homicides that take place. Things keep changing. There's plenty of these kinds of unbelievable stories that happen. And there are many other times that Newport reappears in this story besides the trial. So I want to talk about this in terms of the scandal. Even though it's becoming a national scandal, it still rivets this community in Newport as well. As I said, mob violence and burnings of effigies of Avery erupted all over New England in the aftermath of the trial, and Newport was the site of some of the most dramatic of these expressions as well, as the public's desire for justice, and they took to the streets to express that common desire. And it happened within the first weeks after the trial. Now, one of the reasons is the Methodist Church gathers and meets about 6 days after the trial, and they choose to publicize that they've completely exonerated Avery of any wrongdoing or even suspicion of wrongdoing. And this is what produces these kinds of outbursts. Within a few days, 3 miles from the Newport courthouse in neighboring Middletown, at an oceanside bluff known as Hanging Rock, opponents of the verdict constructed elaborate tableaux vivants that would demonstrate and show the case itself. First, they burned an effigy of the 12-man jury. Then they constructed another, which had the Bristol preacher hanging from a mock gallows. And then they had constructed another one on the beach below, so that you could be up either at Hanging Rock seeing that image or look down below. And down below there was an image of Avery on his knees in prayer with a rope around his neck in those forms. As one Newport newspaper said, the people of Middletown are not easily moved by trifles, so they must have felt their indignation deeply if they've given vent to it in this particular way. Another fascinating example is Liberty trees. So all over New England, there were examples where this happens in Liberty trees, including here in Newport. If you know, Liberty trees were one place where the American Revolution, where there were lots of sort of tarring and feathering of people who were loyalists or who had not on the right patriot side of the revolution. And the British knew this was important. So when Newport was taken over and occupied by the British, they cut down Newport's Liberty tree to make sure nobody could sort of gather at that location. So when the independence happens and the war's over, Newport residents rebuilt a Liberty tree. It's at the corner of Thames and Farewell Street. In fact, we came in and passed that location today. And so, however, it never has a public protest, a street protest, a tarring and feathering or burning an effigy until the summer of 1833, when people gathered there to burn effigies of Ephraim Avery. Newport was riveted by this. Newport's Methodist Church itself also was kind of divided in this sense, almost folded, that meeting house that I showed you, over its divisions about this as well. So finally, let me point out that Avery's trial also points to a critical question that I mentioned from the outset. How does one do criminal justice in a popular democracy? And I think this is really, at this moment in our own time, we can truly understand the importance of this. We understand the significance of the question of whether the courts and the criminal justice system or other forms of collective justice could be trusted to hold people accountable for their crimes. When political forces, especially populist sentiments, push and pull at the levers of justice and punishment. And this case has all of those episodes as well. Avery's trial and the explosive, divisive scandal that followed it raised this unsettling matter in a host of different ways. But let me just focus on one in particular. When the pamphlet war over Avery's innocence and guilt emerges, both sides begin to hurl conspiracy theories at each other. In fact, conspiracy politics permeated the political culture of the moment that this trial takes place. It's exactly the same time in which the anti-Masonic third political party emerged in the 1830s, fearful that a group, the Freemasons, could easily subvert justice for their own members. And so the anti-Masonic movement though Avery was never connected in any particular way, gave a handy political language, we might say, for people to be able to talk about things at that time. And so commonly, critics of Avery and the Methodists began to accuse them of behaving exactly like those kinds of enemies, to engaging in conspiracies, of coaching witnesses, bribing lawmen, packing the jury, and many other forms of behavior. It's not clear that there's evidence of anything that goes along those lines, but conspiracy theories don't necessarily need that. And what's fascinating is the Methodists, in turn, lob conspiracy theories right back at their opponents. They say there's a secret plot by the haters of religion who want to who are jealous of this rapidly growing religious group, and they wish to sort of bring it to its downfall. And the editors of Newport's newspapers, including Newport's newspaper called the Rhode Island Republican, under the pseudonym of the editors calling themselves Proteus, became one of the earliest versions of this kind of prominent voice that questioned Avery's innocence as well. The editors made the argument that the preacher needed to stand before a different tribunal than just a jury trial. In their words, he must face the court of public opinion. And this phrase gets used repeatedly throughout this trial, that this case would be settled not by a jury alone, but by a court of public opinion. It gets repeated so often it's impossible to quantify. The scandal and the hostility generated by this trial overflowed with these arguments that public opinion was the true arbiter of justice. But other people were also wondering if public opinions are mobs and mob violence or secret authors who pen themselves under pen names and such, under pseudonyms, does this represent public opinion or the feeling of the public? These are the questions this case provokes, and I'll let you read and determine how you have it. But Avery's inspired mobs provoke this unsettling question: how would criminal justice work in a participatory democracy? Could justice be achieved when people themselves were glorified as the judge and jury? At the moment in which public opinion was being glorified and canonized as the principal force of an emerging popular democracy, the engines of public opinion, like the news media, popular demonstrations in the streets and otherwise, pose the gravest threats to the execution of criminal justice within the rule of law. And these remained at that moment existential questions for that era and for our own. So thank you for listening. I hope this has sparked your interest in America's first sensational trial, the first crime of the century. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about this story. Thank you. Yes?
How did you first become aware of this story?
Yeah. I stumbled on it when I was in graduate school at Brown University, and I had the opportunity to kind of co-design a college course around this case. And I'd since taught it for about 10 years of different places that I was teaching at, a long time at Swarthmore College, which I teach, which is outside of Philadelphia. And that's the main purpose that I had of it. It's just an amazing story to be able to understand how history works. And it's a wonderful way to teach students how to think about history when you have to encounter an episode that it's not really clear. The answers are so clear. How do you understand when two groups of people say opposite things about the same facts? How do you make sense of it? How do you interpret it and develop it? What are the key questions and how do you understand that? So that's how I discovered the particular sort of case. And then since then, it's been an irresistible one. You can see why. Yeah. Yes?
Do you think this case was more sensationalized than, like, say, Helen Jewett out in New York or anything like that because it was the first, or because, like, Helen was a sex worker or things like that?
Yeah. I do think that this has already, one of the key factors is that people thought this might have been the first minister accused of murder in those particular sort of episodes. But I think the major part of it was there was an appetite for that kind of sensational stories and that was already happening before there was a mechanism for finding it. it plays into many more people's lives and experience. People have more connections to it than they do to the Helen Jewett was a prostitute in New York City who was, and the suspected murderer was a young clerk who had moved there and worked in the city, and it exposed the sort of nature of what was New York. For New York's story, it was important. And New York then already had the mechanisms for making it possible. It had the penny press papers. It had the something to put it forward. And in fact, the same illustrator who made those illustrations I showed you about the very bad man and the minister extraordinary is also responsible for some of the most graphic ones about the Helen Jewett murder. But I think in Avery's case, there was this moment in which people are becoming interested in satisfying their desires for the longings for the strange, the odd, the different, but also what seems familiar, this world that was connected to them. And that's the main reason what I argue is that people see their own lives in this story. They see the people they knew. They know women in their family who are now working in the workforce. They know people who are attracted to religious groups, and and what the dangers of respectability are about this. They know these phenomenon that are these large-scale meetings in the woods that are called camp meetings are profoundly popular religious gatherings, week-long encounters where people go to hear preachers preach, but people also understand that people faint, scream, and fall into trances, engage in a lot of other things. Here's a contemporary painting of a camp meeting that might engage it. People attended these by the thousands. Maria Cornell loved these. This is what brought her to Methodism as well. It was also the place where she said that the Reverend Ephraim Avery coerced her into having sex against her will, and that's part of the story that you can read about in the book as well. Yeah.
After doing all your research, any feeling about was he guilty or not?
Yeah. I mean, one answer could be read the book and see whether I convey that in some ways. I understand entirely why a non-guilty verdict happened. The best legal talent engaged in a process of the best way you can do it, which is to create as much doubt through as many possible means as you can. Do it for the longest possible form so that an exhausted jury couldn't see otherwise. I always tend to answer this question by saying that most writing at the time suggested that a substantial portion of the population believed he was guilty. Newspaper people who were sympathetic to that idea usually said 9 out of 10, 95 out of 100. Those were the terms they usually used for what people thought in terms of his guilt. I don't necessarily disagree with that judgment. We'll never know entirely. But that is part of the mystery that plays some part. That's a good question. Yeah?
How did they identify her at the beginning?
Yeah.
She's from Fall River. She's in Tiverton.
Yeah. Right.
Pastor in Bristol.
Yes. So it's only a quarter mile from where this farm is to the town line when you're in Fall River. And I'll mention the location and something else about the location in a moment. So it wasn't very long for the Methodist minister of that town, because lots of onlookers were coming. Who is this young woman? We don't know who it is. So it seems likely that various different preachers, ministers in town churches came to look at the body. And this one who was in the Methodist church, not Avery, because it wasn't his church. He was across the bay in Bristol. Ira Bidwell looked at her and said, "This woman's name is Sarah Cornell. She's been attending my church for the last few years." And that's when they first did. The second way they knew it was that Dr. Wilbur, I didn't read that part of the opening scene. He hears news, people speaking in the streets of Fall River, he says, and he heard that a young woman named Sarah Cornell had been found dead. And he rushes off to this scene, and he's the doctor who says that she came to him in his office hours and said that she thought she was pregnant, and confessed that she thought Avery was the father of the child. There's lots of fascinating parts about Wilbur's testimony, including how little medical knowledge a medical doctor at that time would determine whether she was pregnant or not. He wrote down and testified that he took her pulse and looked at her tongue. So you wonder why the women who laid out the body might have felt they knew something more about bodies in that time period. But that's part of the story as well. Did that answer that? Yeah. Oh, let me tell you about the location for a moment, if any of you know Fall River at all. Eventually that state line moves continuously at different points in time, and the Durfee farm, just after the Civil War, the state line moves farther south, so that becomes part of Massachusetts and not Rhode Island. The reason the trial is in Newport, neither of those people had ever, Ephraim Avery or Maria Cornell had no connection to this town, but it was the county seat for the county location for Tiverton, so that's where the trial would happen here. Eventually it moves down, and that becomes part of the Fall River. The Durfee family, including John Durfee, who founded, when he dies, they give back that farm to the town of Fall River, and it's currently a park that was first called South Park, and then it's now called John F. Kennedy Park, that you can still go and see the same location where he walked down the hill to do so. And her body, however, was exhumed at that point in time and moved to a grave. You can read about that in the book as well. Yes?
When you have such a juicy story, as a writer and historian, do you set out with a preconceived idea, or do you set out saying the information will tell a story?
Yeah. The information never tells the story. It's always going to be the historian's story, and in this case, this is my story of this. Did I know what that story was going to be initially? No. I wrote it in a variety of different ways until it finally dawned on me, and I explained this in some ways. How when someone put a little hint into my mind, this sounds so much like a play, Bruce, that I suddenly realized, yes, that's exactly how it was unfolding and why were plays so important and how that story played. So I told this and organized it around that kind of structure. I emphasized the kind of the dialogue that happens in a courtroom, and I reconstruct that as the dialogue that goes back and forth of how someone would tell those stories. So that plays a part in how I crafted the tale and story. The other is it's about a lot of things, okay? So I have to keep the story about these two people's lives and what we know about it. So a major part of my task was to keep Maria Cornell's story at the forefront when it became so easy for her to become something else. She became a stereotype for people, as I read in the beginning opening. She becomes these labels that aren't necessarily true, but I wanted to sort of dig deeply into what was her life experience and what was she really sort of longing for and what was going on, and that's a major part of the book. So there are many, many choices that go into it, and with so many twists and turns in this case, and I've had a lot of those conversations. Can I tell readers yet that this is going to happen or not? As often as possible, I want you to find out when you find out, such as like the fact that people are going to fight over and even kill each other over this case. So I'll give you that hint. You can find out how that plays out in the story too. Yeah. Thank you for that question, though.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It seems like everyone's appetites have been whetted to purchase the book, so if you'd like to leave with a copy, we can certainly help you with that. Thank you, Bruce, for sharing this fascinating research from the story.
Yeah.
You all have